Wait a minute. What's so amazing about grace?
You are listening to All Things Grace podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Majors. This podcast is dedicated to answering one question: how can we move through life with more ease and flow and grace? How do we bring grace to family drama, our careers, our bodies, and health? What about racism and oppression? Or the most challenging of them all, ourselves? It's all about grace, y'all. Let's talk about it. Hey, everyone, and welcome to the All Things Grace podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Majors. Thank you for hanging out with us today. Now, many of you know that I am a race equity consultant with Grace. Race equity consultant, DEI, belonging, whatever term you're most familiar with. When I first thought of this podcast, I thought, wow, how great would it be to talk every week about all the different ways that Grace works with this very brilliantly designed, horrible system called racism, and how we can really move the needle forward on coming together around race and racism and anti-oppression and pro-equity. Well, I figured out real quick, I don't want to talk about this every week. I don't want to talk about race and racism and all of that every week, but I do want to talk about how grace plays out in our lives, right? So when we think about race and racism, that's one aspect of our lives, but our lives are so much more expansive and bigger than that. And grace actually has a role and a part in every area of our life, whether you're talking about your personal relationships or your health or family. With that said, I am today going to bring back the conversation about race and equity. And joining us today is Nicole Franklin, co-founder of Enhanced Interactions. Now, this is a consultancy that provides expertise in pro-equity and anti-racism organizational development, as well as leadership and individual development. And I am so excited to have her join us in this new capacity with this new exciting consultancy that she has created. And when I think about Nicole, I think about someone who is fierce, unstoppable, dynamic, powerful, a powerhouse, and also someone who holds awesome space for grace, even with all of that, right? So thank you so much for being here, Nicole, and sharing space with us today.
Thanks, Michelle, for having me. Excited to be here today.
So first, I'm going to ask you to bring us into your world of pro-equity and anti-racism.
Yeah. This is a concept of, over 25 years of work in this field in government and private sector. I'm really seeing kind of what works. And so we start this concept with pro-equity, right? An effort to end all systems of oppression. I think that a lot of times in this space, folks are coming oftentimes to this work from their lived experience and their oppression. And that's a great place to enter this work and conversation. I think we all do better and we will all move further when we start understanding other people's oppression. And so, the goal should always be an effort to eradicate and end all systems of oppression, which we know are the upstream root causes of inequities. Mm-hmm. We want to intentionally ensure an intersectionality approach, leading through an anti-racism lens. And when I think about pro-equity anti-racism, it's a flexible concept. Since most of my work here is in the United States, although I do some international work, we can look at the numbers and we can understand that racism, the effects of racism, that was where we see most of our greatest inequalities. But if I was doing work in India per se, I might have my concept be called pro-equity anti-casteism, right? Or anti-sexism, because we know there's gender inequalities and there's a strong caste system that's running in India. So we want to be able to understand that this pro-equity anti-racism framework is really about ending all systems of oppression and kind of leading through an intersectionality approach with the system of oppression that's most salient to the population you serve or the geography that you're in.
Got it. So can you distinguish a little bit pro-equity from equity as we know it and as you think about it?
Yeah. I mean, equity to me is understanding, moving forward, making change for things to be equitable, right? To ensure that people have the ability to thrive, right? To make sure that in any indicator that's important in any field that we're looking to decrease the difference between the top and the bottom 20%, or basically close the relative inequity gaps. Um, Being pro equity, I think is just gives it an action on top of it, right? I think in this work, we've had a lot of iterations of things, and I think it's clear to understand like what's the work, what's the concept, what do we want to be able to do as an organization or as an individual. And so I think, the work is equity. The work is equity and belonging. But when I think about a concept of what kind of an organization do I want to be, right? I want to be a pro-equity, anti-racism organization. What kind of person do I want to be, right? I want to be for equity, pro-equity, and I want to be against the systems of racism, and I want to dismantle those systems and any other systems of oppression. And so the pro, just like anti, are kind of making a statement beyond the theory of what needs to happen and needs to be understood. And it's a statement of, not on the fence, right? I'm actually for this. I'm actually for ending all systems of oppression.
What about how grace look for folks of color?
Yeah. So again, when we're thinking about our journeys, right, they're an individual journey and then an interpersonal journey. So when we talk about grace for folks of color, we want to have grace for ourselves and where we are in our journey, especially in our healing process, right? And we're all in different spaces of that, and knowing that we're triggered at different rates depending on where we are in that process. So having that grace and love for ourselves as BIPOC folks, to understand that at every level of healing, we're still gonna get triggered. We're still gonna fall into it. We're still not going to be as effective as we might need to be because we're spending time dealing with responses to the trauma that we face and the socialization that we've had. And then bringing that to the interpersonal as we interact with other BIPOC folks, really having the grace for their experience. I started off talking about how a lot of times when we do this work, we come from our systems of oppression. I will come as a woman, as a Black woman, right? Um, and being able to understand each other's oppressions and having the grace and the space to be able to do that will allow us to build more connections, be stronger, and move forward stronger. But I also think having grace for where people are in their process. We have folks that have done a lot of healing and are ready to strategize. They're ready to move forward. They're ready to go. And then there's folks that are still need a lot of healing. We all need healing. I'm not saying that no one's 100% healed. Again, it's a journey and it's a continuum. But folks that are earlier in their healing process, and it's very hard when you're in a place of healing and hurt and being triggered constantly at so many levels to be in a place of strategy and moving the needle forward and realizing that our colleagues are in different spaces on that continuum and that we need to have grace and actually create space for those. That's one of the things that I work with organizations that have affinity groups in their workspace, is to really look at, you need to have a space for healing and you need to have a space for strategy and action. And some folks can live very well in both of those spaces. And some folks need to live solely in those spaces for a while to where they feel and can get to be comfortable. And so it's not a you have to be here or there, but to know this is a space for healing and this is a space for strategy and action and moving things forward. And so that's a way to operationalize grace in a strategy in that perspective. And so, like I said, I think having grace for one another is to realize that we're at different places in our healing journey and that we can appreciate and respect everybody at what space they are and realize that they may show up in different ways and be ready to do different things. and that all of those things are important in that individual healing process and as we collectively heal together. As I look at the interpersonal grace of BIPOC folks or white folks, you know, again, I'm very clear about holding people accountable. There's a huge difference between intent and impact, and you have to be accountable for your impact. But being able to deliver that message gracefully leads to more desirable outcomes. Now, let's be clear, there are folks that you can deliver the message gracefully, and they just clearly aren't interested in having the impact of anti-racism and ProEquity. And I'm not talking about those folks. I know that there are definitely people that do not want to do this work. And let's put those aside. Those are the resistors, right? I'm talking about your front runners, your first movable middles, being able to have the grace that they're going to step in it, be able to talk to them in a way that they can hear it. Because again, nobody learns from a little child to the oldest person on this earth in blame and shame well. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that we still don't give them the feedback and that we don't hold them accountable and that we don't expect and measure if the change happens, right? But being in blame and shame and in the space that's lacking grace is not the best space for us to be to move the work together, individually, collectively, move the work.
I want to pivot just a little bit because there's something that you said that really raised up a thought for me, and that is making it plain and making it clear to those who are listening, or for those who actually kind of this work resonates, or these conversations we're having resonate with you, this idea of doing grace or leading with grace in this work. And that is this: although folks like Nicole and I are center grace in our work, do not mistake that, don't get it twisted, that we don't get angry, exhausted, hurt, sad, devastated. Every new person that is killed by the police, it's just as much a devastation as go back in time, right? And I think people mistake this perspective of leading with grace as not necessarily giving a pass, but maybe we are of toxic positivity, right? Where we are just putting this thing, we're not realizing the hurt and the pain and the trauma that we walk around with, that everybody's walking around with as we talk about leading with grace. And not only, and I'm not going to speak for you, Nicole, but not only do I see it, but I feel it. And I feel it even more so as someone who feels the weight of the conversation, but still committed to finding some light to for us to trudge through, to figure out, to see, right? To get to some kind of place of hope. That is not easy. And I think that it's important to raise up that when you are talking about grace and hope and compassion and love, there is still that other side that we grapple with as well. When we got on, when we started this conversation today, I said, "How are you doing?" You said exhausted. And when you said it, I was like, oh, that's right. That's so real. And sometimes I forget how exhausted I am. And so it's important. And I just wanted to name that as an actual thing. It's exhausting to lead with grace and to bring people together who are hurt and distrustful and traumatized, and rightfully so. Do you have any thoughts about any of that, Nicole, to add?
Yeah, I love the riffing. I love the optimism, pessimism, and realism. Mm-hmm. People will often call me an optimist, and that's, in my opinion, just not true. I am absolutely a realist. We created the systems of oppression. We can 100% undo them. It might not happen in my lifetime. That's where the realism comes in, right? But it is my responsibility to start the path, to continue the path actually that's already been laid before me, to make the change in the world that I want to see. But I have no question in my mind that these systems cannot be eradicated, right? Because we actually created. That's not optimism or hope. That's realism. A lot of times we'll talk about it's the same thing around folks. well, you're so optimistic that, white folks are going to change. And I think that the reality is we're all as human beings capable of change. Yes, we've been socialized. Yes, it's hard, but it is realistic that the change can happen, right? So I think that a lot of times because um, we spend a lot of time because our human brains count pain more than it does positive things. So we all know, like, get a bank in a relationship, you got to have 3 positives to every 1 negative, right? Um, and so, to me, I think that we're so used to being victimized, living that way, being hurt, living in that pain, that just the ideal that these things can happen and can change, that people can change, that we can actually eradicate these systems seems super Pollyanna optimistic, when in fact it's absolutely realistic, and that we have a view of what that looks like. And love and grace can kind of help temper our ability to kind of come to that more realistic space. And what I mean by that is, we know that basically love and fear are on opposite sides of the spectrum, right? And like I said, I kind of said in the beginning, like, grace is one of those operating, tools that we have for love. I think hate is one of those operating tools that we have for fear. Mm-hmm. And so when I think about this work, and really everything is a continuum, right? I really like to get the message out that we really can do this. It is a realistic construct that can happen. And it's not this, as you said, Pollyanna, optimistic type situation, that realistically it can happen. I just think that our baseline set sometimes is lower because we're dealing with so much trauma, that something that's very realistic seems like it's from an optimistic perspective. And so I really appreciate your bringing that into the space, because I think it's clear that we want to have that, not rose-colored glasses, but we also don't want to have our glasses be tinted in a hue of what's fearful. And so we want to really do have that open, clear space of what's realistic. And grace, love and grace is what's gonna get us there, individually, collectively, and within our organizations.
I can't think of a better place to end this conversation, Nicole. Thank you so much. Okay, so where can we find you, Nicole?
All right, well, if you want to connect with me individually, please reach out to me on LinkedIn profile. And if you want to see what our organization is doing, what we're up to, and how you can engage with our consultancy, reach us at enhancedinteractions.com.
Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today, and definitely would love to have you back. But before we leave, we have a fill in the blank for you. Grace is
love.
And there it is. You heard it here first on All Things Grace podcast. Grace is love. Thank you, everybody. We will see you and talk to you again next Wednesday. Have an amazing week in grace. Be well.